You're listening to the Saving Elephants podcast, a place where millennials express and defend their conservative values in hopes of restoring the Republican Party. Join us as we reignite conservatism for millennials.
My guest in this episode is Stephanie Slade, senior editor at Reason Magazine. Stephanie has been on a tear for the last several years writing about liberty, virtue, and classical conservative positions. Topics we cover very often with other guests in this podcast, but as a fellow millennial, Stephanie also has a very close pulse on what's going on today in the right in America. And her new book, Fusionism, Liberty, Virtue, and the Future of the American Right, pulls on all of these threads. You can read her full bio in the show notes, but I won't belabor the introduction anymore. I give you now my conversation with Stephanie Slade.
You're listening to the Saving Elephants show.
Stephanie, so good to have you back for a third conversation. Definitely enjoyed it. The first two, I had mentioned to some friends I was having you on to talk about your book, Fusionism. They were conservatives, but they thought that maybe it had something to do with cultural cuisines, some sort of a cookbook. So I wanted to start here because unfortunately, there's a good many conservatives that don't know what the word fusion or fusionism really means. So why don't we just do our level setting? How do you define fusionism?
Yes, I always start by saying, so we're not talking about cuisine, we're not talking about fusion music genre, we're not talking about fusion and fission power, we're not talking about the cryptocurrency product that I think exists that has that word in it. This is basically just the idea that liberty and virtue are both necessary for human flourishing, or another, I think that's the most helpful way to begin. At a deeper level, I would say it's a philosophical synthesis between the classical liberal political tradition, which says that liberty, individual liberty, limited government, rule of law, free markets, separation of powers, all these things, that classically liberal political tradition and the Judeo-Christian moral tradition need each other, that we need to care about defending both those things, that a good society needs to have both of them, and that they came together in a sort of unique way at the American founding, that our founders were essentially fusionists. They wouldn't have used that word, of course, but that they were bringing together those two traditions in a way that was essentially unique in history. And that's one of the things, at least, that we mean when we talk about American exceptionalism in this 250th anniversary year.
I love how your book does a walkthrough of conservative history and kind of these snippets. You can take deep dives into these individuals or ideas, but I think you do a really good job laying them out, getting down to the kernel of what do they teach and how does this relate, or either defend or maybe argue against the fusionist view. You can't, the proto-fusionists, of course, William F. Buckley, M. Stanton Evans, and you can't talk about fusionism without talking about Frank Meyer, the high priest of fusionism in a lot of ways. But what I found interesting in your book is that you really begin it prior to that, juxtaposing F.A. Hayek as more the liberty standard bearer and Russell Kirk as the traditionalist or the virtue standard bearer. And I understand why. It's sort of you're showing, well, here are the two different camps before we're going to talk about how Myers sort of, let's call it synthesized or show that they had some relationships. Can you help paint for me briefly, though, because I've heard people argue, was Hayek and Kirk were kind of both fusionist, even though I don't know that they would have accepted that idea. And it seems like that's sort of where you land, is that they really both were saying kind of the same thing from two different ends of the, two different sides of the same coin, if you will. Is that your view? And do you think they would have taken issue with this idea that they were in Meyer's camp?
I think it depends when in their lives you would have asked them about it. But yes, that is where I land. So I started out thinking that I was going to write about these two individuals as representing the two opposite poles, and like a magnetic poles they're pulling against each other in a way. And that there was this competition over whether the traditionalist or the libertarian sort of side of things would be the dominant ethos and philosophical animating principle behind the American conservative movement as it emerged in the post-war years. So I thought that it was going to be a story of competition, but when I actually sat down and really spent time reading both Hayek and Kirk, what I realized is what I came to believe is that they are both incredibly fusionist. In other words, Hayek, although he is a libertarian and he's one of the sort of foremost defenders of free markets and individual liberty and rule of law. He also believes very deeply in the importance of tradition, that we as a species, through millennia of trial and error, have figured out what works, what produces a flourishing society, and that is part of what we hand down from one generation to the next through in successful societies. We hand down those things through tradition. And so he was very much a traditionalist, actually. And although he wasn't personally religious, he thought that the Judeo-Christian moral tradition, the importance of Christianity and religion more broadly, was a really important mechanism for helping to transmit those traditions from generation to generation. So, wow, Hayek, he's quite traditionalist, actually. And then you sit down and you read Russell Kirk, and you think Russell Kirk, who famously talked about the chirping sectaries of libertarianism,
had bad things to say about libertarians.
Yeah, he called us political lunatics once at a speech at the Heritage Foundation. But you sit down and you read his stuff, and you realize, oh, this man is a libertarian in many ways. Okay, is he a purist Murray Rothbard libertarian? No, but he was actually during the World War II era, very strongly, and Vietnam and whatnot, strongly opposed to the draft. He thought that was a form of human bondage. He was against it. He was a critic of us dropping the atom bomb on Japan. He was a proponent of basically free market economics. And a lot of people don't know this. It's not what he's most famous for, but he wrote an economics textbook that is very free market oriented. So he's not a purist and he always said this, right? Russell Kirk was always saying his conservatism is a sensibility, not a dogma, and so it's a little bit fluid. It changes over the course of his life. It just changes on his mood, depending on his mood or who he's in a debate with at that moment. And unfortunately, he clashed in a friendly way with Hayek. Hayek's essay, Why I Am Not a Conservative, which as many people know nowadays, was actually a speech that he delivered at the Mont Pelerin Society, and Russell Kirk offered a critical response to it. So they clashed in a friendly way, sort of debating conservatism versus liberalism in the Hayekian sense, meaning classical liberalism. And Kirk also clashed, unfortunately, with Frank Meyer in a less friendly way. They had some personal antagonisms there. They were both critical of each other's early works, but they actually over time came to have a respectful professional relationship with each other. So although they started out criticizing each other, I think Frank Meyer eventually realized that he had been unfairly harsh toward Russell Kirk in his early reviews of, for example, The Conservative Mind. And he ended up coming, I think, to have more respect for him, and would often, when he was books editor at National Review, either commission Kirk to write reviews of other people's books for National Review, or would make sure that he would get a good review of Russell Kirk's books, reviewed by somebody else in National Review. And when he put together a collection of essays at one time, he reached out to Kirk and got him to contribute one. He said it was really important to have your voice be a part of this. He said he always read Modern Age, which was the journal that Kirk founded. So they had, that's why I say it depends a little bit. When you would ask Kirk, are you a fusionist? I think he would probably say no. He probably wouldn't want to be associated with the word that we all think of Frank Meyer with. But I think they really were a lot closer than it seems like from the outside.
Yeah, and I would, as an admirer of both Hayek and Kirk too, I would tend to agree with that assessment. It's funny. I'm kind of thinking here as you mentioned that Meyer and Kirk having a less than friendly dispute. I put together a lot of live stream panels, and I have to be careful sometimes because I deliberately pit people together that don't agree ideologically. But what I found hilarious is that I actually have a bigger struggle not with ideological differences, but with personality differences sometimes. There's sometimes people that actually agree, but I can't put them on the same panel because they do not like each other. I think it's kind of funny how so many of our conservative or traditionalist forefathers, I think, shared that kind of animosity at times when maybe they were saying pretty dang close to the same thing. I want to expand the bookends then. If your original intent was sort of, well, let me show you the liberty flavor with Hayek and the traditionalist flavor with Kirk as kind of bookends, and maybe found out they were closer together. You obviously throughout the book go further with the bookends to those who I think we would agree, and they themselves would say, we're clearly outside of the fusionist camp. We're standing outside, critiquing it from outside, from both the liberty and the virtue standpoints. And you do what I would have expected. L. Brent Bozell, William F. Buckley's brother-in-law, is sort of the stand. And you use a lot more individuals than him, but he's sort of the beginning of this kind of, I'm going to critique fusionism from the virtue standpoint. I'm going to say, no. Virtue comes first. It's superior to liberty. Liberty might even undermine virtue in certain cases. And I do want to spend a bit of time, obviously, talking about that. But I was kind of curious. It's been a while since I read it, but in George Nash's History of the American Conservative, the intellectual, oh good grief, I'm blanking on the name of his book. The History of Intellectual Conservatism in the United States of America since 1945. I think he really needed a shorter title, but it's a great book, which you cite often. I think throughout this work, if I remember correctly, he set up bookends between L. Brent Bozell, and then at the other end was Murray Rothbard as sort of the high end of arguing for its liberty, not virtue. Liberty comes first; it trumps virtue. And I could be misremembering that, but I guess I wanted to start here. Rothbard obviously gets mentioned in your book, but it's almost as more of one of the many names on the other side of the transaction. Did you deliberately downplay that, or did you find that? I guess another way of saying that is, did you not find as easy, helpful bookends on both ends of these arguments, or why downplay Rothbard, or why not put another substitute in there?
That's a totally fair question, and I suppose I could have actually done that differently. I could have maybe I should have. I was writing this book in part because I feel like I've been watching as a journalist and as just a member of our polity, watching the sort of right of center politics in this country seem to go increasingly crazy over the last 10 years or so. And so I'm speaking specifically, and I wrote this specifically with conservative, self-identifying conservatives in mind. And so people who identify as conservatives, I think I wanted to remind them of why both liberty and virtue matters, but at a moment when I think they're experiencing a lot of pressure, a lot of voices telling them liberty is a problem. Liberty is the problem. We need less liberty. Liberalism failed. Liberalism is the kernel that, the rotten core of America, and why we need to reject the founding. Liberalism is the thing that, needs to be overthrown or replaced. And so I guess I was focused more on the people who were arguing either for virtue at the expense of liberty, and that's Brent Bozell. He would be the sort of epitome of that. Or later in the book, I talk about the more modern dissident right and the neo-reactionary movement, and the idea that essentially this whole liberty virtue philosophical stuff is beside the point, because politics is war, and what matters is just acquiring power and using it against your enemies. And so forget all this fusionism stuff. It's all just standing in the way of people on the right being willing to wield power in a realist way against their enemies. So anyway, I guess I could also write a book that's focused that was more geared towards convincing my fellow libertarians that they need to spend more time thinking and worrying about virtue, and that is certainly part of this. But I think that I guess the reason I focused more on Bozell and less on Rothbard was that my main motivation behind this whole project was to try to remind conservatives of why they used to think that liberty was so important and why they shouldn't abandon that commitment.
Yeah, no, and that's part of why I asked. I was wondering what your thought process was there, and I think that's entirely fair. In all fairness, George Nash wrote his book in the 70s, so a very different period of time. I'm trying to pull up here. Oh, here we go. Here's a quote. I'm quoting you from the book. One common misconception about the fusionist worldview is that it is insufficiently committed to the traditionalist project, and I think that kind of highlights what you had just said, that although, in all fairness, I'm sure you wouldn't disagree, there are plenty of libertarians that take an axe to fusionism. We do seem to be in a moment where the broader, I don't want to call them, I'll call them conservative in the extremely gregarious sense of the word, broad sense of the word, does seem to be struggling with this notion of where does liberty fit in. So let me back up there, and let's look at L. Brent Bozell, who is I've not read a biography of Bozell. I probably need to, because the little snippets I get from the guy, aside from his politics, was just a fascinating character in a lot of ways. But and also quite evolved significantly in his lifetime, right? You were kind of talking about earlier with Kirk and Hayek. It might depend on when you asked him. With Bozell, good grief, it might depend on when you asked him what his views were. I think he's an entirely fair stand-in for sort of the argument against fusionism from a traditionalist standpoint. However, I think he's also understandably not all that sympathetic in certain degrees, or to put it another way, I know of people who criticize fusionism from a traditionalist standpoint who would be insulted to say that you were linking them with sort of Bozell and his essentially support for fascist governments and a confessional state and things of that nature. All that being said, let's strip that back for a moment. What was Bozell's basic argument against Meyer? Like it's a, I know that Meyer had the idea that virtue and liberty are mutually reinforcing, but it seems like an entirely fair critique to me to say, no, hold up. It might be true that you can be virtuous in a free society, but couldn't you be virtuous in an unfree society? In fact, isn't there, in some sort of an ultimate sense, isn't that precisely when, let's say, Christianity shine the most is under persecution? Why? What if a lack of liberty is literally what engenders virtue?
Yeah, he makes the argument. He also makes what I think is almost the flip side of the argument, which is he basically says being virtuous is really hard and people need all the help they can get. And so we should not be so squeamish about passing laws and using the coercive power of the state to help people make virtuous choices. That's the thing that Myra is objecting to, I think. This idea that we can coerce, that it's a good idea or it's possible. Those are two slightly different arguments, but that's either a good idea or even possible to use government to make people or make the culture be virtuous. And Bozell seems to just have over the as he's evolving, because he starts out as quite a libertarian, and he converts to Catholicism, and he eventually embraces an ever more sort of radical traditionalist, but also statist, authoritarian Catholicism. And so he, over time, he becomes convinced that we should be using the state in this way, and he seems to think that we can, and that there's no good reason not to, basically. Whereas Meyer thinks there are a lot of good reasons not to. He thinks, for example, that if you empower the state in that way, that power corrupts. So this is a very Lord Acton kind of thing, right? Power corrupts. The state already has to have a monopoly on the use of violence in order to keep the peace in our society. If we're also going to empower it to decide what a virtuous life looks like and to try to, use its coercive powers to make people live up to that standard, it is going to or very likely to become tyrannical. It is very likely to use that power badly. So I think that's a pragmatic argument, and I think that's quite persuasive. We've seen that a lot in history. And I think Meyer would have said, like, Bozell is insufficiently attentive to that problem, to that probability. But Meyer also says something that Bozell takes issue with. This is maybe what you were getting at. Meyer basically says coerced virtue isn't really virtuous. We can force somebody to make, quote unquote, the right choices outwardly. You can put a gun to somebody's head and make them go to mass on Sunday, for example. But that you don't get any moral credit if you only did something because you were coerced into it. And so there does need to be some element of freedom in order to allow people to exercise their ability to make choices for themselves, to sort of flex their moral muscles and be actually confronted with difficult choices so that they can learn what is good and what is wrong, what is good and evil, what is right and wrong. And so I think there's really something to that. Now, Bozell, this might be just a question of degrees, because Bozell seems to think what Meyer would say is we can try to persuade and pressure people into making good choices through non-coercive means, through social pressure, through the marketplace, through just trying to reach hearts and minds and convert them and persuade them into making good virtuous choices. But we shouldn't be willing to use coercion. And Bozell seems to say, like, I don't see what the difference is. If you can't use coercion, then why is it okay to use social pressure? So there's just a difference a disagreement over whether there is really a difference in kind between coercive and non-coercive pressure. I think there's a really important distinction between those two things. I think we need to always keep that distinction in mind, and that it is always much more problematic to use coercion against somebody. And I believe that because of my Christian beliefs, because I believe that every human being was created in the image of God, and therefore if there's something morally offensive about me thinking that I should get to use coercion to force somebody else to overrule their free will that they received from God. But anyway, there was just this difference of agreement about whether that freedom was an important component in virtue. And another thing that I think Meyer believed and wrote, and I definitely think is true, is that even if it's the case that in the gulag you can still make virtuous choices, and even if you're not allowed to actually act on them, you can still want to act them out, and there's virtue there. That was one of Bozell's arguments. Meyer says there's something about virtue that encompasses a more expansive understanding of virtue, that encompasses acting on the gifts that God has given you and to become the most excellent version of yourselves. It's using your creative capacity to go out and do good in the world. And that actually would be, even if, you could have credit for wanting to do that, even if you're under a politically repressive regime that won't allow you to do that. Sure. but you can't actually go out there and be virtuous in that way. So it stifles or restricts our ability to have that sort of active virtue that involves going out and acting in the world, that and becoming the person that we were meant to be, that God created us to be. That understanding of virtue really does require a measure of freedom. And so that these things are intertwined at a deep level, that we can't just we shouldn't treat them as merely in an antagonistic relationship, and we should not treat freedom as incidental or unimportant, or as something that we can just sacrifice in order to get more virtue, which is kind of what the more radical traditionalist would be tempted to do.
I do want to spend a bit of time on the idea of coercion and the public and private aspects, how that fits into Meyer's framework. But when you started your response there, you said something I thought was very helpful. That is it good and is it possible? Right? Is it good to compel virtue through political or states means, and is it even possible? And I think on the latter, and we could talk about that, but previous episode I had on James and Thomas to talk about their new book, Why Post-Liberalism Failed. Where we kind of go through quite a bit, and a big chunk of their book is just devoted to demonstrating historically how, if it's possible, it's sort of like socialism. It ain't happened yet. Like every time we've tried this, it hasn't worked. But I do think it's an interesting question. Is it good? In other words, sort of I've heard this asked of the socialist question too. Well, what if socialism could work? Like, what if it could be demonstrated in this with this particular mechanism or with these particular leaders, it actually would produce the results it promises? And I would say the same thing here. What if there were a version of I don't want to call it confessional state, because I'm not just trying to wed it to, say, a Catholic integralism, but let's just say anybody's idea of concept of virtue. Someone could say, well, look, obviously I shouldn't say obvious. I think there's a good many people would say, I believe there is some role for the state to play. We might outlaw prostitution or gambling or pornography. Certainly we outlaw certain things like murder. But then it's like, well, is it just a question of where we're drawing lines? Like, we can't really outlaw hate, because what does that mean? Whose definition is it? But what if is there a compelling argument that says, look, even if outlawing X does in fact compel virtuous behavior, it in and of itself is still an injustice, say, to just outlaw, or maybe I shouldn't even say outlaw, to compel speech, to compel action. Is that in and of itself unjust, even if we could demonstrate it works in the sense that it's helping us to becoming more virtuous people?
Yes, I think very much so. I think that you have to recognize that there is a moral component to liberty, in addition to it is both a means to an end and also an end, in the sense, or good in and of itself. I think that's really important. And this is kind of what I was getting at when I said, I'm a libertarian because I'm a Christian, because I believe that every human being was created in the image of God. I think there's something wrong, morally wrong, about coercing somebody or using violence or the threat of violence against them to try to make them live the way I think they should instead of the way they think they should, up until the point where they're infringing on someone else's rights. That's why it's fine from my perspective, from a libertarian perspective, from Frank Meyer's perspective, totally fine to have laws against murder. Murder is a clear violation of somebody else's rights. It's much more debatable whether we should have laws against drug use, that if it's only you're hurting yourself, because that means I'm substituting my judgment for your judgment in a way that I think is in fact morally problematic. And maybe we think in some circumstances it's worth it because there's a higher good that makes it legitimate, or maybe we don't. But I do think there's a moral component to this. There's an injustice in running roughshod over and trampling over somebody else's ability to make choices for themselves, as long as when those choices are not infringing on somebody else's basic rights, life, liberty, property rights. So yeah, I think that there is a justice component, a moral component to the liberty case. It's not merely instrumental, although it also is instrumental in many ways. In other words, having a free society, I think we've seen through history, does produce all these other good outcomes as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I think that's sort of at underlying is we desire a free society, but then people begin to ask the question, well, wait, what? Because obviously with liberty, we can choose virtue. But what happens if we don't? What happens if people choose vice over virtue? Do we not have some obligation to stop in and intercede in that case?
Yeah, and I get very uncomfortable. This is why I am ultimately, at the end of the day, I am a libertarian. I get really uncomfortable with the idea of using the law to protect people from themselves. Now, I should say, just to complicate this a little bit, when we're talking about whether there would be a sort of injustice done if we had a confessional state, or just, if we were using the coercive power of the state to try to enforce virtue in whatever way, in whatever case. I do think it probably matters. For example, if you have a society that's overwhelmingly Christian and they vote through the legitimate democratic process to have laws that they want because they say, I feel like I am going to trip up and do things that I consider to be immoral. And so I want there to be laws that will help me make better choices. I think that is a lesser injustice than a situation like what we have heard people like Adrian Vermeule at Harvard Law School argue for, where he acknowledges Catholics are and especially radical, integralist Catholics are a tiny minority of the country. But if we can just get our people into the correct positions of power in the government, we can impose our views on the people, whether they want it or not. They'll eventually come to thank us later. I find that even much more morally objectionable because it's anti-democratic, because it is, again, imposing something on somebody against their will, which is different from somebody saying, I want to choose to have laws that I think will help me make the choices that I want to make, that will hold me accountable and help me to make better choices down the line. I still think that they're both a little bit problematic, because in the second case, even if it's a democratic, the polity votes to have a law against pornography, against prostitution, whatever it is, there's still going to be some people that are dissenting from that, and that are going to be, there's minorities that are going to have their rights trampled in the process of this. There's always going to be dissenters. And so that's part of why I think having a light touch when it comes to coercion is always preferable. But there's still greater and lesser degrees of injustice that we could be talking about.
I appreciate you making that distinction, and this is something that has long bothered me about the Adrian Vermeules, the Bernie Sanders, if you'll pardon the expression, the radical libertarians even. It's like, why don't you work with the federalist system we have? Pick a town, heck, pick a state, and show us that this Catholic integralist model, or this radical libertarian, or this, let's say, democratic socialist model works at some local level. And then if it's successful, we might consider scaling up. Why do you have to take over the entire freaking nation and force your particular view on all these? As you mentioned with Adrian Vermeule, I think he's quite explicit about. I'm thinking back to having James and Thomas on that he that was always the standard retort against Catholic integralism is, why do you assume it's the Catholics that would be in charge if we had a religious theocracy? You guys are not in the majority. And he has an answer, which is, we're not trying to convince everybody. We're just trying to pull the levers of power until the masses don't have a choice. And it seems like, it's weird to equate Vermeule with Sanders, with, I don't know who is standing for a radical libertarian anarchist, let's say, but these together, they have very different views. But in some ways, I think they're all very similar. They seem to have a notion of, we need to do some sort of an end run around the actual wishes of the people, because by golly, if we could just get our way, it turns out that's in their best interest and they're going to love it. Or at least there's a small enough dissenters that won't, that who cares about them anyways, rather than trying to figure out how to genuinely work with a pluralistic society of over 330 million people.
Absolutely.
Again, sorry, my soapbox. I don't know if there's a question there, but so let me ask then. I kind of mentioned this. This is an oversimplification, but my understanding of Meyer's synthesis in liberty and virtue is that, again, oversimplification. I don't know if he would say this in totality, but kind of a notion that I'm hyper for liberty if we're talking about the public sector. I'm hyper for virtue if we're talking about the private sector. Or in other words, it's a sort of, that is how these things are balanced, is that it's the role of the public sector to protect, defend, promote liberty, so that in our private lives, in our private institutions, in our intermediary institutions, the church, the state, or I shouldn't say the state, sorry, the church, the neighborhood, union hall, what have you, we can... coercion is not the right word. I think you'll probably have a better word than I do, but we can impel or encourage virtue. And as you said even earlier, I think we can all relate to this. A virtuous life is a hard life, and I want to live a virtuous life. I need a lot of help. I deliberately put certain limits on myself, or have certain accountabilities that I look to from other people, not from the state, but from my own personal life. So I guess, could we expand on that? And is that an oversimplification? Like, is it just as simple as saying anything public, pro-freedom, anything private, pro-virtue? Or how would you describe that?
No, I think that's an okay way to think about it. So I talk a lot, I really emphasize in the book, I use the phrase, the terminology of governmental and non-governmental spheres, because I think that public and private can confuse some people. Like, what we're not talking about, public. Somebody might say, well, the marketplace is the public square, and so, but the marketplace is a private. It's non-governmental. It's a non-governmental sphere. I'm not saying that you can't bring your faith out into the public square, into public places, bring it with you when you go out into the world, make decisions in your life on the basis of your convictions and your beliefs. I am saying that it's not government's place to prioritize making people virtuous, that it's government's job it's the highest political value. Meyer said the highest political value is liberty. That doesn't mean the highest value is liberty. The highest value is virtue. But in the political sphere, when we're talking about the things that the government does using its coercive powers, that it should be prioritizing protecting people's basic rights and liberties and carving out a space and protections so that you don't feel like somebody is going to come and force you to wear a hijab at the point of a gun or wear a cross at the point of a gun or whatever it is. You have the right to then go out into the public space, but in the non-governmental sphere, and pursue virtue as you understand it. And that's as individuals and as members of communities. That's really important. You're not just atomistic individuals floating in society without help or influence of anyone else. We are embedded in a whole overlapping patchwork of networks and communities of various kinds and influenced by institutions of various kinds. And that's as it should be. That is the fusionist alternative to the government making us virtuous, is that we have civil society, that we have community, that we have families, that we have all of these other institutions that can help us understand what it means to be virtuous and how to pursue that and to help us to do that. So yeah, the non-governmental sphere, and Frank Meyer would say, liberty is the highest political value, but it is not the highest value. He recognized virtue is actually superior. I think that's pretty important. But when you take the purpose of virtue and try to make that the highest value of government or the purpose of government, then you open the door to tyranny. That's just a mistake. That we need to sort of understand these separate spheres and keep the different liberty and virtue orientations in their proper place. And it goes the other way as well. If you were to take liberty and try to make that the highest virtue in your private life, then you would be cutting yourself off from all kinds of wonderful forms of community and meaning and belonging that we all need to thrive as human beings. Because you'd be trying to maximize your independence and your freedom, your autonomy in a way that would prevent you from actually achieving flourishing. So those two things, but unfortunately in our world today, we have very often, I think, flipped them. So we have government trying to make people virtuous, and we have people trying to live lives of maximal freedom. And this is just the opposite of the sort of fusionist equation for happiness and flourishing.
I appreciate you saying that, because that of course is a huge critique, or you saying that we're not just atomized individuals. I know you don't believe that, but I think there's a lot of individuals who, shouldn't say a lot, there are critics on the right, I'm thinking of the Patrick Deneen sort, who think there's sort of an inevitability to the atomization. And my standard line on his criticism of liberalism failed is that he may be right, that liberalism contains within it the seeds of its own destruction, but that's because all isms, being human, contain within them the seeds of their own destruction, right? So we socialism contains within it the seeds of its own destruction. It's sort of a question of trying to balance priorities in a certain sense, and what gets us closest to. Well, I don't want to get too far off there. I'm probably I need to think through that before I just sort of spout those ideas. But I guess the point there being, let me put it this way. I think it is a fair concern to say we live in a world that is at constant danger of atomizing, that the individuals are in constant danger of over-prioritizing liberty within their own lives. That is not the same as saying the fusionist project is wrong or is not worth defending, but it is worth saying, but these are dangers we fusionists are well aware of and speak against. And as I said earlier, virtuous life is hard. I don't find it easy. I'm completely okay with the notion that this is not an easy thing. There's no guarantee to it. That doesn't mean it's not worth striving toward. And again, I apologize. I don't mean to get on a soapbox. Since we're about in the midpoint, let's pivot a little bit, because everything we've been talking about, I think, could still be covered under the George Nash up through the 1970s understanding of these arguments. But the 70s was a long time ago. As you rightly observe, we're kind of in a unique moment. You chart for us, I think I've got this right. You broadly have three groups, the theocons, the natcons, And I appreciate you landing on the neo-reactionaries. It's that third group that I think every time I've had you on and every time I've had a guest on to talk about it, we have to come up with a new word to describe these yahoos, because they're, I don't know. How do you summarize Bronze Age pervert or Mencius Moldbug? They come with such colorful names themselves. But these are the three, if you will, groups these days that are kind of fighting against this. I think the more common term they'd use is the dead consensus, right? The old zombie Reaganites, those of us who are just trying to hold to some older version that, might have been okay in the 80s, but it's no longer workable today. Could you help sketch for us who are the theocons, who are the natcons, and then who are these darn neo-reactionaries?
Sure. Yeah. And so I think to start with, I should just say that one of my contentions, I don't think this is controversial, but one of the important facts that I argue is that Fusionism becomes the consensus on the right in the second half of the 20th century. It is this philosophical synthesis, this dual commitment to liberty and virtue is sort of the foundation upon which the whole institutional conservative movement, think tanks, publications, advocacy organizations are all sort of constructed with a shared understanding that this is what we believe as conservatives. This was what it means to be a conservative in America. There were always dissenters, people like Brent Bozell, but they were the losers in the debate, so to speak.
Yeah,
Okay,
just to emphasize that point, as you say, it's not controversial. I think it's fair to say anti-fusionist would even agree with that in that era, that was the ascendant view.
right. So what we've seen in the last 10 or 15 years is that consensus breakdown and a schism open up on the right between the people who still, broadly speaking, are committed to that fusionist equation of liberty and virtue, classical liberalism, and the Judeo-Christian moral tradition, versus what I call as a sort of umbrella term to capture all of the anti-fusionists. I call them the dissident right, and because they're dissenting from that consensus. But then to try to be a little more granular, I break it down into the three camps that you mentioned. And of course, this is still very broad brushstrokes. I'm having to oversimplify it. And there's a lot of overlap between these groups, and there's a lot of people that are moving from one to the other on a given day. And there's new divorces opening up between former allies within this movement.
It seems like Sohrab Ahmari has his foot in every group, depending on what area we're talking about.
Yes. And the other person who has a foot in every single one of these camps is J.D. Vance. I spent a lot of time on Vance.
Right.
But okay, so just to give the quick overview, the theocons, or who they call the theocons, sometimes also referred to as post-liberals, tend to be the religiously motivated anti-fusionists. They're the ones who say, we think too much liberty is getting in the way of virtue. So Bozell was the forerunner to the theocons. We want more virtue. We do not look around and see as much virtue in society as we want. We don't think people are flourishing. We don't think people are thriving. We don't think people are living virtuous lives, or that they feel like they have access to that. And so the problem, we think, is too much libertarianism, and we want to roll that back, reorient the conservative movement away from a focus on free market economics, rule of law, limited government, and instead be willing to use government in a muscular way to try to help people live virtuous lives. Those are the theocons. And of course, virtue as they understand it, they're from their perspective. Many of them are Catholics and at least adjacent to the Catholic integralists, but also some Protestant, post-liberals, Christian nationalists, and so on. Then you have the National Conservatives. And again, lots of overlap between these camps. There were post-liberals at the first NatCon conference and vice versa. But I think there is a nationalist and particularly populist economics, protectionist economics, anti-immigrant, anti-free trade, America first, more skeptical of American military intervention abroad. This sort of again, America First nationalist economic and policy orientation that's associated with the National Conservatism movement, or NatCon movement. One of the things I argue in that chapter, though, is that although it was supposed to be this sort of high-minded rethinking of Reagan-style free market economics and reorienting the conservative movement or the Republican Party towards a more working class economic policy, that was the idea, that was how it was presented. It ends up really devolving into pretty pure culture warring. So that I go to the NatCon conference almost every year when it's in the United States. Sometimes they have them abroad. I don't always get to go abroad, but I've watched as more and more and more the people on the main stage are advocating just pure war against the left, treating politics as war. This is going to actually, I'm foreshadowing what we're going to hear about when I get to the neo-reactionaries. But basically, there's this pure culture war. They're the enemies. We need to get power so that we can destroy our enemies as the overwhelming, motivating, or animating ethos that I see at these national conservatism conferences. And so it becomes a lot less. I mean, the populist, protectionist, what I would call progressive left-wing economics are still there for sure, but there's that does not seem to be the main consideration. Nor is it what Yoram Hazani, the founder of these conferences, would argue, which is that we're just defending the nation state against outside influence from these transnational governing institutions like the United Nations. No, that's I mean, yes, they're against that. So are libertarians, by the way. The thing that seems to be really giving energy to this movement is the culture war, from what I've seen, and there's just a lot of young people and people who are just really disaffected by what they consider to be the old, like, Reagan style or George W. Bush style Republican Party that was too polite and too civil and too focused on playing nicely with the Democrats, when instead we need to realize that we're in a war with existential stakes and they want to destroy us, and so we need to fight back in kind. That brings us to the neo-reactionaries, because I think that this is where the neo-reactionary sort of ideas have bled in and sort of eaten the NatCon high-minded, policy wonkish, good intentions. The neo-reactionaries are essentially authoritarians. They're out and out authoritarians. They say we need a strong government that will seize power and use it on our behalf for our friends against our enemies. Politics is war. It is not a truce where different diverse people with different beliefs and values learn to live in peace with each other. That's the liberal understanding of politics. Politics is a way that we find a way to live together in peace. That's liberalism. These are anti-liberals. They want a strong, muscular state that is controlled by them, that is used to reward their friends and to punish their enemies and to impose their understanding of the way that society should be structured on people, whether they like it or not. And depending on who you talk to, this can take different forms, but often it comes with the sense that the strong and beautiful and intelligent should rule over are the better specimens, and they should rule over our lesser, quote unquote, bugmen, the masses who don't deserve to have any political power anyway, and the strong do what they will, the weak suffer what they must. That's a sort of accepted, realistic part of politics according to the neo-reactionary worldview.
I listed them in the same order you responded to them, which is the same order you put in the book, and it would have been, I think, a very different book if you start with the neo-reactionaries, because you kind of have to build some credibility before you talk about the nut jobs. Otherwise, people just assume you're nut picking. And I am curious here, because I'm of these three camps. I think of the theocons. There are people in the theocons camp. I don't know if you'd be comfortable with the term, but I'm thinking of someone like a Patrick Deneen. Why liberalism failed and you may have a very different take on it. I enjoyed the book. I disagreed with it profoundly, but it got my creative and intellectual juices going. There were some arguments in there. There were things to tangle with. Clearly, Deneen is an intelligent person. I don't agree with him, but in his book Regime Change, I not so much. And that was my biggest takeaway with why liberalism failed, is like, well, so long as he's not offering me the alternative, I can't argue with him too much, because I don't know what his actual. It was when he offers the alternative, like, no, wait a minute, what are you talking about? And I would say with the nationalist conservatives, you mentioned Yoram Hazani. Again, don't agree with the guy, but he's an intelligent guy. I don't, for obvious reasons, I don't think a dude named Yoram Hazani is anti-Semitic. I think, as you have correctly written, while nationalist conservatism may have a racism, may have an anti-Semitism problem, I don't think that was his intention. I get the sense that a Patrick Deneen or Yoram Hazani are people I disagree with strongly, but could very well be entirely decent, virtuous, wonderful humans in their own life. Intellectually rigorous, people who genuinely want what's best for society. I have a hard time with the neo-reactionaries coming. The most intelligent I can think of is Tucker Carlson, who I despise. But there's even, I don't know why we take Curtis Yarvin seriously, other than the fact that serious people take him serious. I despise Nick Fuentes. I have nothing good to say about the guy, and it's kind of an. I don't know, is a fair assessment or not? Because I can think of the theocons and the natcons have terrible people in them, don't get me wrong. But to me, there's a gambit there. There's people I can have decent arguments with. I have a hard time with it. I wished I could ignore the neo-reactionaries, because I just feel like they're a bunch of cosplay Nazis. I don't know how else to say that. I'm not trying to do a leftist. Everyone who disagrees with me is a Nazi. Heck, some of them embrace the freaking term Nazi or fascist. Am I wrong there? Is that your read on it too?
Well, what you said earlier, I think, is the key, which is we have to take them seriously because other important people take them seriously.
Right.
And so the thing that is critical to realize about these guys is that they have a huge following, particularly among very online young men on the right. Huge following. Nick Fuentes, Curtis Yarvin, and many of those young men on the right, and some young women, but mostly young men, are now beginning to populate positions of influence on Capitol Hill and in the Trump administration, and probably in other places too. I have heard that there are a lot of folks who are reading these things who are going to law school with the intention of wanting to be a federal judge someday. Uh, so these ideas are being imbibed actively by a generation of young people who are now ascendant and beginning to have influence, and we know for sure that there are a bunch of people in the Trump administration who, because it became a thing for a while for people to post a picture of themselves with the Bronze Age perverts book with their military uniform or their police uniform or with their congressional office or whatever in the background, so that you wouldn't show their face, you won't know who it is, but
Right.
that somebody in a position of power or in a job in the administration or in the government is reading these ideas. And so one of the things that young people are attracted by and always have been are edgy, provocative ideas. I think I often say 15 years ago, this benefited libertarians. We were the edgy, provocative ones, and people were interested in our ideas. And this is kind of what brought people into the Ron Paul revolution in a way, right? He was willing to say things that other people weren't willing to say and call for more radical alternatives to what normal politics, things that seemed like they were maybe outside of the Overton window, like end the Fed or legalize heroin or something. This was edgy and provocative, and young people were attracted to that naturally. Nowadays, I think libertarianism is considered passé and boring, and the edgy provocative stuff is this sort of neo-Nazi white nationalist, misogynistic, send all the brown people back to where they come from, strip women of the right to vote. Like these liberal developments were all mistakes, and we need to go back to a world in which the strong men rule over their weak, lesser parts. So that is, I'm not saying that is like the thing that Donald Trump wakes up every day being influenced by, but I'm saying there are a lot of people around him, including his vice president, who we know are tied to the people who are articulating these ideas. And so that is, I think, a reason why we have to take them seriously. And one of the other things you hear from the people who read Curtis Yarvin or read Bronze Age Pervert or watch Nick Fuentes videos or whatever, what you'll often hear is they're funny. They're funny. They have a sense of humor. There's this sort of ability to maintain a ambiguity about whether you're supposed to be taking the ideas seriously or at all, or if it's just performance art. And so that gives them this plausible deniability, their ability to say, well, I don't necessarily agree with it, but I think it's entertaining. But meanwhile, when you're imbibing the ideas day in and day out, and in some cases actually like articulating them back. So we have had all these like group chats that keep leaking where all these like young Republican staffers are trading Nazi jokes, Hitler jokes. They're doing it behind closed doors to be funny. But at some point, you have to ask: are you just do you become the person that you pretend to be after long enough? You start to internalize the ideas that you're receiving, that you're steeping yourself in over time. So that is, I think, the reason for concern.
Yeah, there's a lot of directions I could go there. I am all for provocative humor, although I also juxtapose it with, as I keep mentioning, virtuous life is hard, and that I dare say we really need to model the kind of behavior we hope to, achieve. But before I go too far off there, I wanted to throw in, I don't want to call them a fourth group, but I'm thinking here the majority of people I know who are, I hate the term Trump supporter because it means something different in this era than it did in prior. Sort of this notion, do you support Trump as sort of do you a priori agree with whatever he's going to do next without reflectively talking about it? But let's say those who would identify as on the MAGA right or the Trumpists, I dare say there's a good many of them who would listen to the definitions you gave of Theocon and Atcon and a neo-reactionary and say, I don't fit in any of those camps. And I do think that's one of the interesting things about this moment, particularly among the NatCons, is I think they have discovered that maybe they aren't quite leading where exactly the right is going, as they presume they were going to be the inheritors of whatever comes after Trump. Is like, well, maybe not. Maybe, as you astutely put, maybe their followers are more interested in the culture war than they are in what Orrin Cast's economic policy is. And I'm wondering here, how would we, broadly speaking, how would you depict Trumpism as different from, say, fusionism? In other words, if we're saying, look, if your average Trump supporter is not going to a NatCon conference, or they're not arguing for a confessional state, or they're not online reading Bronze Age Pervert, they're just, quite frankly, a normal person going about their daily life who happens to think that Trump is the bee's knees. How would that Trumpist, say, differ from a classical, I don't want to just wet it to Ronald Reagan Bull, say 1980s classical fusionist that you're arguing for?
A really important distinction, because Trump himself is very, very anti-liberal. He does not, I think, he has some impulses, like he wants to get rid of the Department of Education. Okay, that's like a good libertarian policy prescription. Okay, but for the most part, Donald Trump does not believe that there should be any legal or popular constraints on his ability to exercise his will, right? He reluctantly, when he's forced to, accepts some constraints. When he runs into a wall and he can't, despite throwing all the power at his disposal as the president of the United States at it, can't seem to break through that wall, he will back down. But he doesn't think that he should have to. He thinks he should get to do whatever he wants. He thinks the law is what he says it is. That is fundamentally anti-liberal. That is the opposite of liberalism, which is the idea of rule of law, not of man. Okay, so Trump himself as the man, not even in the same universe as fusionism, but since fusionism requires classical liberalism and those commitments to limited government, checks and balances, rule of law, etc. Trump supporters are different, as you point out. This is a great sort of wrinkle to add into this, because I have found, just talking to people, as a reporter, reading polling data, reading books that ethnographic studies that historians and scholars have done, that most people out there are ultimately fairly committed to sort of without maybe using the word, the classical liberal idea that the point of all of this is to try to find a way to live peacefully with each other, right? How do we live in peace and have a good, flourishing society, despite the fact that we believe different things, have different religious views, have different political commitments, have different values, want to raise our families in different ways? How can we find a way to live together and not be in a constant state of civil war?
Mm-hmm.
That's mostly what people want. They want their rights to be protected, and they basically want other people's rights to also be protected. That's what polling shows. That's what people say. They want to be left alone. What has happened, though, over the last generation or so, is that a very large percentage of Americans came to feel that the left had been co-opted by fringe, radical, militant practitioners of a sort of identity politics that was hostile to normal Americans with normal views. And that all the sort of positions of cultural influence, the mainstream media, higher education, Hollywood, the federal bureaucracy, have all been captured by people espousing these radical militant views. And so instead of being able to be left alone, they feel like we're not being left alone. We feel like we're under siege. And so then when they feel like they're under siege for long enough, at some point they're going to say, well, forget living in peace with other people. I want somebody who's going to fight for me and defend me and my rights against these attacks that I feel like I'm experiencing. And so I think it's understandable why they would turn to somebody like Trump. I can't imagine voting for Donald Trump. I've never done it myself, but I think people who feel a sense of having been disenfranchised, having been subjected to this sort of militant, hostile abuse at the level of the culture wars, and in many cases at the level of government overreach during, say, the Obama administration or the Biden administration. What do you always hear? Well, he fights. At least he fights. He fights for us. That's what they want. That's what they like. So they're not motivated by any kind of philosophical rejection to liberalism or fusionism, in my opinion, for the most part. Whereas these thinkers that I've been talking about, and YouTubers and all, in the dissident right, are in many cases philosophically committed to overthrowing fusionism and replacing it with something else. Most Americans, most voters are not, most Trump voters, most people on the MAGA right, I think, are not. They've just had enough of the far left, And so it's caused their desire to get back at the people who they're mad at has supplanted their commitment to the sort of classical liberal values that like Reagan once espoused.
Yeah, and I appreciate you putting it that way, because I dare say I think a lot of them would not either recognize or agree with that notion that their support, let's say, of the Trumpist model is at the expense of Reagan values. Maybe some would, but I think that's sometimes at bottom. I spent in my 20s. I spent an enormous amount of time reading The New Atheist and trying my best to learn all of the language for how to have an apologetic conversation with someone who is a hardcore atheist. And then I discovered almost no one I knew was a hardcore atheist. Almost no one I knew who was not a believer was reading Christopher Hitchens or Dawkins. And I don't think that was an invaluable practice. I think it was helpful, but sometimes I wonder if if we don't fall into that, I shouldn't call it trap. That's not the right way to put it. But if I'll put it for myself, is constantly guilty of this mindset of trying to figure out how to argue against the neocons and the theocons and the neo-reactionaries. Sorry, I shouldn't say neocons. I meant natcons. That's a whole other conversation. If I spend a lot of time arguing with these individuals, when it turns out the vast majority of Americans who elected a guy that I consider to be a dire threat to the liberal order, the fusionism I hold dear, are not any of these things, are not reading these books, and having arguments with them in this lens would be completely meaningless, because like, what the heck are you talking about? Of course I love the founding. Of course I love our founding ideas. And I would even dare say that I think a good many Trumpists would consider themselves to be in line with the founding vision, whereas like your extreme versions of especially your theocons and your neo-reactionaries, maybe less so than natcons. You can clarify there if I'm wrong, but certainly the theocons and neo-reactionaries, from what I understand, are very open about rejecting the American founding. Most Trump supporters don't. In fact, they see it as a point of pride. We're standing against the radical leftist who reject the founding. We are the last vanguard of hope for the United States, if you will. And so I guess because your book concludes with what is the title? New Words for Ancient Truths. And obviously you present powerful arguments against those radical voices who stand against those ancient truths. But I'm wondering to what now, and let me clarify, there's a lot of chapters, and I don't think anybody would walk away from this book saying, I don't know what Stephanie thinks about Trump. I think you're pretty clear. You don't think he belongs in a fusionist camp. 2028, we're all kind of, at least I'm dearly hoping Trump is going to, not because he passes away, but just chooses to, although that's probably wishful thinking, just stays out of the freaking election and we get to a different era. I don't personally think it's a given the natcons are ascendant. I certainly don't think the theocons or the neo-reactionaries are likely to gain power. It's possible, but unlikely. I don't know if classical fusionists will. I wonder if we'll have yet another reactionary, I'll call it demagogue for lack of a better word, someone else who captures the entire culture war, who doesn't have some strong sense of where they stand on the founding, but is able to kind of galvanize support on the basis that I fight for you. It seems to me that is just as much a threat, and maybe less a threat and less corrosive, but more a threat and more likely. How do we come up with this new language for ancient truths, convince our fellow Americans who are probably on our side that virtue and liberty are not only worth defending, but that we ought to be on guard against this sort of demagogic impulse to fight the culture war in a way that undermines virtue and liberty?
I'll say the more the Democratic Party embraces or is taken over by its more radical elements, socialists, people who think that Thanksgiving is a terrible like colonialist holiday, whoever we're talking about.
She lost that race, fortunately, but yes.
There's a live debate happening on both the left and the right, is I guess what I want to start by saying. And to the extent that the more radical voices on the left are successful in the next 2 years, is more likely that the radical voices on the right will be more successful, and vice versa. The left is being empowered by the radicalism of the right now. So this is unfortunately a terrible sort of ratchet that's happening, where each radical contingent is empowered by the oversteps and the crazy things that that its counterpart is doing, but it just keeps getting more crazy, unfortunately. So it's hard to make predictions, but the fact that most Americans, even most Trump voters, are not committed to these actually crazy statist authoritarian ideas that the dissident right, many thinkers on the dissident right or thought leaders on the dissident right have been articulating, is an opportunity for us. It's one of the reasons that I do think it's worth engaging with the ideas and pointing out how un-American they are, is that realizing that things that Trump is doing and things that people around Trump are advocating are totally contrary to what the founders intended and would have wanted for us, and the values that we as a country have always stood for. That, I think, can be a persuasive argument to people. That can give them pause. Hopefully will give them pause. Now, in a moment where they feel like the threat from the left is just so great that they want somebody who's going to defend them at all costs, are my arguments about the founders' commitment to liberalism going to overcome their desire to not see like a Bernie Sanders or Mamdani or somebody be the next president? Probably not, maybe not. But it's still worth making those arguments, I think. And I think that I'm hopeful that the more moderate voices on the Democratic Party will also be successful, because that's, I think, the only way that this turns out well. I mean, there is a chance for a reset. Whenever Trump does finally exit stage left, and it will happen eventually. It will happen.
As Jonah Goldberg says, either constitutionally or through the actuarial table, will happen.
Right, exactly. There is an opportunity for a hard reset. There is an opportunity. I think there's a lot of people out there who are I almost use the phrase hungry for fresh blood, which has the wrong connotations, but they want fresh blood, right? They want something new. They want somebody who's younger, who brings a fresher perspective. They want somebody who's a little bit more reasonable seeming. I think one of the reasons Biden won in 2020, a big reason actually, is that he initially campaigned as, I'm going to be a uniter, not a divider. People are hungry for that. So there is an opportunity when Trump is gone for something for the sort of fever to burn itself out and something a little more sane to come in. But I don't think it's a foregone conclusion. I think, again, the crazier the left goes, the more likely it is that the less likely it is that we have that sort of good outcome on the right, and vice versa. And so, but the thing that gives me hope, I guess, is that we are seeing, even during these 4 years when Trump is in office, we're seeing a lot of his overreaches be met with decisive popular backlash, right? The American public wants there to be a control of the southern border. They do not want to see masked ICE agents tackling people and shooting them on their streets of their cities. They want prices to come down. They do not want this seemingly erratic tariff war that is going on, where on any given day, based on the mood that Trump wakes up in, he changes the taxes that they as consumers have to pay for the things that they want. Like, there are things that he's doing that the people clearly dislike. And so again, it's like there is a potential for a natural correction to happen for some of this, and for a savvy person, I think, to run for office on a little bit more of a middle of the road sanity platform, to say we're going to try to bring people together again and turn the temperature down on all of this culture warring. Whether that's going to happen, I'm not making a prediction. I'm just saying that's the possibility that I hold out hope for my own sanity.
Yeah, the prediction business in politics is a dangerous game. So I do appreciate the caveats, but I think that's well founded and entirely possible it could go that way. I pray to God we're at the end of our tether for the left and the right, experimenting with the more radical elements, but we'll see. The name of the book, I'm holding up my handwritten copy, simply Fusionism by Stephanie Slade. At the time this episode drops, it won't be available, but you can get it on pre-order. I'll put the links in the show notes. Stephanie, I'm sure we'll have you back. I don't think this is a settled issue. I'm sure there have been many more things to argue about it. But thank you, as always profit from the conversation. And thank you for taking the time to come back on the show.
Thank you for having me back on.
Thanks for listening to the Saving Elephants podcast. Be sure and subscribe for future episodes. Do you have a topic or question about conservatism, millennials, the Republican Party, or anything else that you'd like us to cover in a future podcast? We would love to hear from you. Email us at savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. That is savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and catch our weekly Friday blog posts at savingelefantsblog.com. That is savingelefantsblog.com. Join us next time as we reignite conservatism for millennials.